Some people just don't know what they have until it's gone, and Reed. He had everything with me. But let me start from the beginning because this whole mess needs context. If you enjoy this story, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. I need all the support I can get right now. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this plays out. I met Reed 2 years ago at this upscale lounge downtown, not some dive bar with sticky floors. I have standards. I was there with my friend Kelly, who was desperately trying to ditch some Tinder disaster, and Reed was celebrating some work thing with his crew. He looked good in that suit. I'll give him that. Sharp jawline, confident posture, the kind of guy who clearly had his life together. When he called me the most interesting woman in the room, I knew he had taste. We clicked immediately. He was witty, successful, and most importantly, he seemed to understand that quality comes at a price. Within a month, we were official. Reed worked in some corporate position that paid well enough to afford a decent apartment and take me to nice restaurants. I was between opportunities at the time, focusing on building my freelance design portfolio. I showed him my sketches, my vision boards, my whole creative process. He seemed impressed, which was refreshing after dating guys who didn't appreciate artistic ambition. When my lease ended 6 months later, moving in together felt natural. He covered the rent increase without even blinking. That's when I knew he was serious about us. The thing is, creative work isn't like his 9 to 5 grind. You can't just force inspiration on a schedule. Some days I'd spend hours researching trends, studying color theory, networking with other artists online. Reed didn't always understand that this was work, too. He'd come home from his office job and find me in my pajamas, sketching or watching design tutorials, and I could see that little flicker of judgment in his eyes, but he never said anything directly. He was too polite for that, too accommodating. I started noticing how he'd light up when I'd show interest in his day, ask about his projects, laugh at his work stories. He was one of those guys who thrived on feeling needed, appreciated. So I made sure to give him that validation, especially when he was covering our expenses. It wasn't manipulation. It was just understanding what made him happy. And when Reed was happy, he was generous. Dinner reservations, weekend trips, that expensive tablet I needed for digital work. He wanted to provide, and I let him. The apartment became our sanctuary. I decorated it with my artistic eye. Plants, vintage finds, mood lighting that made everything look Instagram-worthy. Reed would bring his work friends over sometimes, and I could see how impressed they were with our space with me. I was the cool, creative girlfriend who made his life more interesting. At parties, I'd catch him watching me from across the room with this proud smile, like he couldn't believe he'd landed someone like me. It was sweet, really. He saw me as this free spirit he got to come home to every day. But here's what Reed never understood. Creativity can't be rushed. Some weeks I'd be on fire designing logos and building my client base. Other weeks I needed to recharge, to absorb inspiration, to let my mind wander. That's how artistic minds work. We're not machines that clock in and out. When I tried to explain this to him, he'd nod and say he understood. But I could tell he was calculating rent and grocery bills in his head. He was too practical to really get it. The routine we fell into worked for both of us, or so I thought. Reed handled the mundane stuff, bills, schedules, maintenance requests, while I focused on the bigger picture of our life together. I made our place beautiful, planned our social calendar, brought creativity and spontaneity to his otherwise structured world. We balanced each other out perfectly. He was the stability I needed to pursue my dreams, and I was the inspiration he needed to break out of his corporate bubble. Looking back, those first months were probably the happiest either of us had ever been. Reed seemed more relaxed, more confident. His friends would joke about how I'd loosened him up and he'd beam with pride. I felt supported, understood, free to be my authentic self without judgment. We were building something real together, something that went beyond just splitting bills and sharing a bed. At least that's what I thought we were doing. Things started shifting around the 7-month mark, but not in ways Reed seemed to notice. I was getting restless, feeling like my creative energy was being stifled by our domestic routine. Don't get me wrong, I loved what we had built together, but I needed more stimulation, more inspiration, than just staying home every night watching Netflix while he worked on his laptop. That's when I started connecting with other creatives in the city. Kelly introduced me to this amazing group of artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs who actually understood the creative process. They weren't stuck in the corporate mindset like Reed. When I'd talk about my design concepts or my vision for building a brand, they got it immediately. They didn't ask about timelines or profit margins. They talked about artistic integrity and authentic expression. Jackson was part of this circle, a photographer who did editorial work for local magazines. He had this incredible eye for composition and understood the struggle of being an artist in a world that only values immediate results. When he offered to do some professional headshot for my portfolio, I was thrilled. Reed seemed less enthusiastic when I mentioned it, asking weird questions about where the shoot would be and how long it would take. I brushed off his concerns. He was just being overprotective. The creative community became my refuge. These were people who stayed up until 3 a.m. discussing art theory, who understood that inspiration doesn't follow a schedule, who valued passion over paychecks. Reed would come home from work to find me energized from spending the day with them, full of new ideas and possibilities. Instead of being happy that I was inspired, he seemed almost threatened, like he was worried I was outgrowing our quiet little life together. I started spending more time out of the apartment, attending gallery openings, creative workshops, networking events. Reed would ask where I was going, when I'd be back, who I'd be with. Questions that felt more like interrogation than genuine interest. When I'd try to share what I'd learned or who I'd met, his responses felt flat, disinterested. He'd make these subtle comments about how I was always busy or how we never just stayed home anymore. The worst part was how he started treating my creative work like a hobby instead of a career. When potential clients would call during dinner, he'd give me these looks like I was being rude for taking business calls. When I'd work late on projects, he'd make passive-aggressive comments about how the apartment was messy or how we hadn't spent quality time together. He wanted me to be available for his schedule, his needs, his definition of what our relationship should look like. I tried to include him in my creative world, inviting him to gallery openings and art shows, but he'd stand there looking uncomfortable, making small talk about the weather instead of engaging with the actual art. My friends started noticing how out of place he seemed, how he'd check his phone constantly or suggest leaving early. It was embarrassing, truly. Here I was trying to bridge our two worlds, and he couldn't even pretend to be interested in mine. The tension came to a head during one of our dinner conversations. I was excited about a potential collaboration with Jackson. He wanted to feature my designs in a photography series he was pitching to a local magazine. It could have been huge for my portfolio, my first real break into commercial work. Instead of celebrating with me, Reed started asking all these practical questions about payment contracts, timelines. When I told him it was more about exposure and building relationships, he got that look. The one that said he thought I was being naive. Brin, he said, in that careful tone he used when he thought I wasn't being realistic. You've been working on building your portfolio for over a year now. When do you think you'll start actually making money from it? The question hit like a slap. Here I was sharing something I was passionate about, and he reduced it to dollars and cents. I tried to explain that creative careers don't follow traditional timelines, that building a reputation takes time, that some opportunities are about more than immediate profit. But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't really listening. He was calculating, judging, measuring my dreams against his spreadsheets and budgets. In that moment, I realized that Reed didn't see me as an artist or a creative professional. He saw me as his unemployed girlfriend playing with art supplies while he paid the bills. The realization stung more than I wanted to admit. The conversation about my career timeline opened something ugly between us that we couldn't close. Reed started making these little comments about my daily routine, my spending, my priorities. Nothing direct. He was too passive for that. But the message was clear. He thought I was taking advantage of him, living off his generosity while pursuing what he saw as expensive hobbies. What really got to me was his complete inability to understand the value of what I brought to our relationship. I wasn't just sitting around doing nothing. I was creating a beautiful life for us. Our apartment looked like something out of a magazine because of my aesthetic vision. Our social calendar was interesting because of my connections. His friends constantly complimented him on how cool and artistic I was, how lucky he was to have someone who brought creativity into his structured world. But Reed couldn't see past the dollar signs. When I'd buy supplies for a project, he'd ask how much they cost. When I'd spend an afternoon at a coffee shop working on designs, he'd comment on the expense. When I'd suggest we go to that new restaurant everyone was talking about, he'd pull up the menu prices on his phone. It was suffocating. Living with someone who reduced everything to a cost-benefit analysis. The worst part was how he started treating me like a child who needed guidance. He'd suggest I look into more stable career options, maybe something part-time, while I figured out the design thing. He'd forward me job postings for administrative positions or retail work, like I was some desperate college graduate instead of a creative professional building a brand. The condescension was infuriating. I started pulling away, spending more time with my creative friends who actually valued what I was trying to build. Jackson and I had been working on that magazine collaboration, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. He understood my vision, supported my ambitions, saw me as an equal partner in the creative process. When we'd work late on the project, talking about art and life and dreams, I felt more alive than I had in months. Reed noticed the distance, of course. He'd asked why I was always working so late, why I seemed distracted when we were together, why I wasn't as affectionate as I used to be. His questions felt like accusations, like he was keeping score of my attention and finding me lacking. The irony was incredible. He wanted me to be grateful for his financial support while simultaneously making me feel guilty for not being the perfect available girlfriend he thought he'd paid for. The breaking point came during what should have been a simple conversation about our future. Reed had been dropping hints about next steps in our relationship, talking about long-term goals and shared plans. When he finally brought up the idea of me getting a real job so we could start saving for a house together, I lost it. A real job? I repeated, staring at him across our beautifully decorated living room, the space I had transformed with my creativity and vision. What exactly do you think I've been doing for the past year? He had the nerve to look confused, like he genuinely didn't understand why I was upset. I just think it might be time to consider something more stable. You're incredibly talented, Brin, but maybe you could do design work as a side thing while you build up some savings. That's when it hit me. Reed had never taken my career seriously. Not once. He saw my artistic pursuits as an extended hobby phase that I'd eventually outgrow. Like a teenager playing dress-up, he was waiting for me to mature into someone who valued security over passion, who would trade my dreams for his version of stability. I looked at this man who claimed to love me, who said he wanted to build a future together, and realized he didn't actually want me at all. He wanted some sanitized version of me, the pretty creative girlfriend who made his life interesting but never challenged his conventional worldview. He wanted the benefits of my artistic energy without respecting the work that created it. You should be grateful I even let you touch me, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Most guys would kill for the scraps I give you. The silence that followed was deafening. Reed just stared at me like I'd slapped him. And maybe I had, but someone needed to remind him what he was actually getting in this relationship. Access to someone completely out of his league who had chosen to share her life with him despite his limitations. After those words left my mouth, something shifted in the apartment's atmosphere. Reed didn't respond. Not with anger, not with hurt, not with anything. He just looked at me for a long moment, then went back to his laptop like nothing had happened. That reaction was somehow worse than if he'd yelled or stormed out. It was like he just dismissed me. The next morning, I expected some kind of conversation about what I'd said, maybe an apology from him for not appreciating what he had, or at least an acknowledgement that we needed to work through this tension. Instead, Reed made coffee for one. He packed his lunch without asking if I needed anything. He left for work without his usual goodbye kiss or even eye contact. At first, I thought he was just processing what I'd said, maybe realizing how he'd been taking me for granted. But as the days passed, his behavior became more pointed. He'd come home and cook dinner for himself, leaving me to figure out my own meals. He stopped asking about my day, stopped showing interest in my projects, stopped including me in his evening routine entirely. The joint credit card incident was the first real sign that this wasn't just a temporary cold shoulder. I'd gone to Sephora to pick up some makeup for a networking event. Nothing extravagant, just the basics I needed to look professional. When the card declined, I assumed it was some kind of mistake. Reed's text response was ice cold. Not my card anymore. That's when I realized he wasn't just being petty. He was systematically cutting me off. The man who had been so eager to provide for me, who took pride in being able to support my dreams, had decided I wasn't worth the investment anymore. It was cruel. Truly, one honest moment about the dynamics of our relationship, and he was ready to throw away everything we'd built together. I tried to talk to him that evening, to explain that I'd been frustrated and maybe said things more harshly than I meant. But Reed had perfected this infuriating, calm demeanor, like he was above the drama I was trying to create. He'd respond to direct questions with minimal answers, acknowledge my presence without actually engaging, treat me like a roommate he barely tolerated. The worst part was how he started moving his things. Not dramatically. Reed was too calculated for grand gestures, but I'd noticed his expensive headphones missing from the bedroom, his favorite books gone from the shelf, his laptop charger no longer plugged in by the couch. He was erasing himself from our shared space piece by piece, and I was supposed to just watch it happen. I threw myself into my work with Jackson, partly because the magazine project was gaining momentum, and partly because I needed somewhere to channel my frustration. Jackson was everything Reed wasn't: passionate, understanding, emotionally available. When I'd vent about Reed's passive-aggressive behavior, Jackson would listen without judgment, offering insights about creative personalities and the challenges of being with someone who doesn't understand artistic temperament. Our working relationship had evolved into something deeper, something that felt more authentic than what I had at home. Jackson saw my potential, encouraged my ambitions, treated me like an equal partner in every sense. When we'd work late on the project, the creative energy between us was electric. He'd bring wine, I'd order takeout, and we'd spend hours perfecting the visual narrative we were creating together. Reed must have sensed the shift in my energy, the way I'd come home energized and inspired instead of drained by his silent treatment. But instead of fighting for our relationship, instead of trying to win me back, he doubled down on his withdrawal. He'd be asleep when I got home from working with Jackson, gone before I woke up in the morning. Present, but absent during the few hours we overlapped in the apartment. The final week before he left, Reed moved through our space like a ghost. He'd packed most of his belongings while I was out, leaving only the essentials he needed for his daily routine. The apartment started feeling hollow, stripped of the masculine energy that had balanced my feminine touches. But I refused to beg him to stay, refused to apologize for speaking the truth about our dynamic. I woke up that Friday morning to find Reed's keys on the counter and a note. Just one sentence. "You don't owe me anything." I just realized I owe myself more. The simplicity of it was almost insulting. After everything we'd been through, after 2 years of building a life together, he left me with a fortune cookie platitude and walked away. My first emotion wasn't sadness. It was rage. How dare he act like the wounded party when I was the one who'd been undervalued and dismissed? I'd given him the best 2 years of my life, transformed his mundane existence into something beautiful and interesting, and this was how he repaid me: by abandoning me the moment I stood up for myself. I called Kelly immediately, needing someone to validate my feelings. She came over that afternoon with wine and takeout, ready to bash, read, and support me through the breakup. But as I told her the story, emphasizing how ungrateful and passive-aggressive he'd been, I noticed her responses becoming more measured. When I got to the part about what I'd said to him, she actually winced. "Brin," she said carefully, "that was pretty harsh. I mean, I get that you were frustrated, but telling someone they should be grateful you let them touch you, that's not just standing up for yourself. I stared at her, shocked that my own friend was taking his side. Are you serious right now? He was treating me like some kept woman instead of recognizing everything I brought to the relationship. Someone needed to remind him what he had. Kelly just looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. What you had was someone who loved you enough to support your dreams for 2 years while you figured things out and you threw it in his face. After she left, I sat alone in the apartment that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. I tried to focus on my work, on the exciting project with Jackson, on all the possibilities that were opening up now that I was free from Reed's judgment and limitations. But something felt wrong, like I was missing a piece of the puzzle. The next few weeks blurred together. I threw myself into the creative scene, spending most nights out with Jackson and the others, coming home to an empty apartment that no longer felt like a sanctuary. The magazine project was moving forward, but the initial excitement had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of trying to make it as a freelancer without any financial backup. When the first bills came due, I realized how much Reed had been covering, not just rent and groceries, but the little things I'd taken for granted. Streaming services, internet, phone plan, the premium art software subscriptions I needed for work. I'd never kept track of our expenses because he'd handled all of that. And now I was drowning in costs I hadn't even known existed. I applied for emergency assistance, tried to pick up freelance gigs wherever I could find them, even considered some of those administrative positions Reed used to send me. But without a steady income history or substantial savings, I was basically starting from nothing. The creative community that had felt so supportive suddenly seemed less interested in helping with practical matters like rent money. Jackson and I had been getting closer, our professional collaboration evolving into something more personal. When he suggested I crash at his place while I figured out my housing situation, it felt like the natural next step. His apartment was smaller than what I'd shared with Reed, messier, was filled with photography equipment and empty takeout containers, but it was bohemian, artistic, the kind of space that felt authentic to who I really was. The relationship progressed quickly, fueled by creative passion and the intensity of starting over. Jackson understood me in ways Reed never had, supported my artistic vision without constantly questioning the practical details. We'd stay up all night working on projects, making love, planning our future as creative partners who would take the art world by storm together. But Jackson had his own financial struggles, his own inconsistent income from freelance photography. What had seemed romantically bohemian at first started feeling unstable, chaotic. He'd disappear for days working on shoots, leaving me alone in his cluttered apartment with no clear sense of when he'd return or what our next meal would be. 3 months after moving in with Jackson, I found out about the other women. Not through some dramatic confrontation, but through social media posts and casual comments from mutual friends. Apparently, Jackson's artistic collaboration approach wasn't exclusive to me. He had a whole rotation of creative women he'd work with, sleep with, then move on from when the next interesting project came along. When I confronted him about it, Jackson just shrugged with that infuriating artist attitude. We never said we were exclusive, Brin. I thought you understood that creative people need freedom to explore all kinds of connections. The casual dismissal felt like a slap. But worse was the realization that I'd left stability for this for someone who saw me as just another temporary muse in his ongoing artistic journey. The eviction notice came 2 weeks later. Jackson had been behind on rent for months, apparently using charm and promises to string along his landlord while he waited for his next big photography gig to come through. We had 30 days to come up with 3 months back rent or find somewhere else to live. I called every friend I had, looking for a couch to crash on while I figured out my next move. Kelly offered her spare room temporarily, but made it clear it was a short-term solution. The others in our creative circle were sympathetic, but dealing with their own financial struggles. The bohemian lifestyle that had seemed so appealing was starting to reveal its harsh realities. That's when Jackson suggested I call Reed. Look, I know it ended badly, but the guy obviously cared about you. Maybe he'd be willing to help out for old time's sake. The suggestion made my stomach turn, but I was running out of options. My credit was shot. My savings were non existent, and my freelance income wasn't nearly enough to qualify for a decent apartment on my own. I crafted a carefully worded email explaining my situation without directly asking for money. I talked about missing what we'd had, about realizing I'd made mistakes, about hoping we could at least maintain a friendship after everything we'd shared. I sent it late one night, drunk on cheap wine in desperation, then immediately regretted it. Reed's response came 3 days later. Short, polite, devastating. I hope you figure things out, Brin. I've moved on, and think it's best we keep that way. No anger, no bitterness, just the calm finality of someone who had completely closed that chapter of his life. The worst part was hearing through mutual friends that Reed was doing well. Better than well, actually. He'd gotten a significant raise at work, moved to a nicer apartment, seemed happier and more confident than anyone remembered him being in years. When Kelly mentioned seeing him at a coffee shop, looking relaxed and content, I felt something twist in my chest that I didn't want to name. Meanwhile, I was back to living with my mother in the suburbs, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by participation trophies and faded boy band posters. Mom tried to be supportive, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes every time she'd ask about my career or when I might be getting my own place again. The creative community I'd been so passionate about scattered like leaves without the financial cushion Reed had provided. I couldn't afford to maintain the lifestyle that had made me feel part of their world. Gallery openings and networking events cost money I didn't have, and my artistic output suffered under the stress of trying to survive. Jackson moved on to his next news within a month, posting photos of his new collaborative partner on Instagram, a young painter who looked at him with the same stare-eyed admiration I once had. The magazine project we'd worked on together was published with minimal credit given to my contributions, and Jackson never shared any of the modest payment it generated. 18 months after Reed walked away, I was working part-time at a chain store in the mall, living with my mother, and watching my artistic dreams crumble under the weight of basic survival. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd had everything I needed to build the life I wanted, and I'd thrown it away because I thought I deserved better than what I had. Kelly visited me one afternoon, bringing coffee and attempting to lift my spirits. As we sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of my former life, she mentioned running into Reed again. He looked really good. Brin, happy, settled. He was with someone new, seemed really sweet, down to earth. They were grocery shopping together, just normal couple stuff, but you could tell they were solid. I nodded and made appropriate responses. But inside, I was calculating what I'd lost. Not just the financial security, but the partnership, the daily companionship, the simple pleasure of building a life with someone who actually cared about well-being. Reed had been offering me everything I'd claimed to want: support for my dreams, belief in my potential, a stable foundation to build from. But I'd been so focused on what I thought I deserved, so convinced that his practical nature was holding me back, that I'd never appreciated what I actually had. I'd traded a man who loved me for someone who saw me as disposable, stability for chaos, a future for a fantasy. The truth is, I did this to myself. I had a good man who supported my dreams, and I threw it away because I thought I was too good for him. I let my ego and my need for validation convince me that his steady love was somehow beneath me. And now I'm living with the consequences of that choice every single day. Some people say everything happens for a reason, that you end up where you're supposed to be. But sitting here in my childhood bedroom, working retail to pay my mother rent, watching my artistic dreams fade into memory, I know better. Sometimes you just make terrible choices and have to live with them. And sometimes the person you thought was holding you back was actually the only thing keeping you from falling this far. Reed was right to walk away. I just wish I'd figured that out before I gave him no other choice. If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.